Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Huffman. Good morning, good afternoon, whenever you're watching this. Now, where we last left off, Jackson was elected president in 1828. And again, he comes to the table. He's not like huge on issues like, say, John Quincy Adams were or Henry Clay was, but he's still going to get a lot of stuff done, some good and maybe some not so good. And really, his presidency, as I've maybe said in the past in class, if not, I'll say it here, is really one of the most controversial presidencies, even now, all the way to 2020. So many of the things he did are still hotly debated. Some people love him, some people hate him. And then that's going to be one thing in the essay kind of thing you're going to be writing about him, is looking at some sources and coming up with your own idea of, was he more of a success or more of a failure? And again, this is still hotly contested even to this very day. It was at the time, and very much so, even more so now, all these years later. And his election is really going to usher in this new era of politics. And this really all starts even from the very inception of when he was actually inaugurated in early 1829. Because in the past, it was really only, dignitaries or people high up in the party machine who were allowed to come to the White House to kind of celebrate or have a party. Jackson really throws the caution to the wind and says, no, I want everybody to come, the average public. I want them to come to the White House. And he really wants to set that up as a way to show, hey, I'm going to be much more democratic. I'm going to be much more open to, fraternizing with and acknowledging the average person. So they kind of have actually a beer bash on the front lawn of the White House. And it really, the Washington, D.C. press and the major Northeastern press, who were used to a more dignified and more maybe conservative kind of way of being and their temperament, are really shocked by this and saying, whoa, he's just inviting anybody to come here. That's pretty radical, right? And that kind of emphasis on the average everyday working American, it can be bore out in actually why Jackson was elected in the first place. Because previously, as I had said in other lectures, that you had to own property before you could actually vote. And what happens in kind of this period from 1824 to 1828 is going to really start to change things, because states had started eliminating property rights as a voting qualification, which so you didn't necessarily have to own property anymore to be elected, or to vote, I should say, in these kind of state, local, or even national elections. And so the federal government really had never had a lot of control in this. This was mostly states who had decided you had to own property. But again, a lot of states are starting to get rid of that. And you can see in these numbers, in 1824, about 355,000 men are going to vote for president. But only 4 years later, this is a pretty radical change. Only 4 years later, and this is when Jackson was elected in 1828. Now, all of a sudden, that 355,000 has become 1.1 million. So nearly 3 times the amount of people who could vote in the past are now voting in the elections. Okay. And so again, this really opens the door and allows people who are maybe from a more lower economic status to now have a vote for the first time. And naturally, when it comes to John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson, they see a lot more of themselves in Andrew Jackson than they do John Quincy Adams. So, and even, about a dozen years later, by 1840, that number had then even doubled to over 2 million. So really from this period of the late 1820s through 1840, you're going to see a mass of, again, it's still white men. So it's not African Americans, it's not women, but even just within the white men population, that number is going to go up dramatically of those who could vote. What's another big change that Jackson ushers in is basically the creation of the spoils system. And what is that? Where basically, he's not necessarily having people who are qualified for people to get government jobs, but you have to have been loyal to Jackson to have got a government job. And so many of those who had been put in place by Adams were basically fired. And basically Jackson said, well, if you're loyal to me, then you're going to get this job instead of being actually qualified. So that's going to cause some problems, because naturally you're going to get people in these government jobs who don't really know what they're doing, don't necessarily have the nation's best interests at heart, but hey, they were loyal to Jackson, so why not go ahead and hire them, right? And this is really a system that has undergone some changes over the years, but has been widely still used to this very day, right? When, George W. Bush was elected, going back more recent times, George W. Bush is elected, he staffed it with a lot of people who were loyal to him and agreed with him. Same thing with Obama. Same thing with President Trump. So, I mean, this is just something that both sides of the aisle like to do. And this is something that Jackson in particular really kind of kicked off all the way back when. So, again, it's not totally a modern problem when you say, oh, the president's only kind of putting people in positions that are loyal to him. It goes all the way back to Jackson. Okay. Now, over the years, there is going to be kind of more rigorous standards for people who are hired than there were at this time. And so that is going to change a little bit. But during this time, again, Jackson really breaks with tradition and says, I'm not going to govern by consensus. Instead, I'm going to govern by if you were loyal to me or you weren't loyal to me. Okay. So what else is going to happen? Well, Jackson's supporters believe that kind of the existing caucus system where only the highest ranking party members chose the presidential nominee was corrupt because it happened behind closed doors, and he wanted kind of these more public conventions where the average person had more of a say, which I'd say is a healthy thing, right? Because it's going to open up democracy more so than it had been in the past. And so he's going to take that kind of closed caucus system behind closed doors and start to open it up a little bit, where he's going to replace that with a national nominating convention, which is roughly basically what we have even to this very day with both parties, right? Where delegates from the individual states are going to gather and select the nominee as a group. It ain't happening behind closed doors anymore. Well, in some ways it is. But on the kind of a public level where people are really paying attention, it's going to happen in front of everybody, where average delegates are going to be able to come and gather, and that kind of nomination process happens out in the open, okay? And in 1832, when Jackson's kind of running for re-election, he's going to help create the Democratic Party. Now, the Democratic Party this is the Democratic Party that is still in existence today. However, the Democratic Party of the 1830s through really about you could go 1920, 1930. So for about 100 years is actually much more conservative than the modern day Democratic Party. They're the more conservative party, and they're going to be, when it comes to issues of slavery, much more in support of slavery. But again, in 1832, Jackson is going to create the Democratic Party. And again, they're still in existence to this very day. So when it comes to the two main parties, the Democratic Party actually is older than the modern Republican Party by about 20 years. They come really in the fold in the 1850s. So Democratic Party now has control, and they're firmly behind Jackson. And again, like Jackson, they're going to be much more conservative in their nature. One of Jackson's biggest problems that he has to face while in the White House is going to be this whole nullification crisis. And you might remember I brought up that term of nullification way back when, talking about the Alien and Sedition Acts, and Jefferson and Madison in kind of the late 1790s, early 1800s were protesting those Alien and Sedition Acts. This is going to come up yet again some decades later. Because in 1828, there was a tariff that's going to be passed in Congress that's going to be known as the Tariff of Abomination in South Carolina, because it really affects South Carolina, because South Carolina had to import many of their goods due to the lack of manufacturing, which goes back to, as I said in the past, that the North was highly industrialized. They had a lot of manufacturing going on. Meanwhile, the South was really slumping behind, had a lot of import, a lot of goods. And so that really drove up prices for those in South Carolina. And so this yet another tariff meant that, that's going to be yet another tax or yet another tax on imports of items coming in, which really drastically hurt some of those southern states, South Carolina, which was very influential in the South in particular. So much so that we get the very first kind of calls for secession in South Carolina, saying, listen, if you don't take this tariff out of us, take this away, we might just secede entirely. Okay, that's what he's threatened. That's what South Carolina's threatening to do. Calhoun, John C. Calhoun, who is Jackson's vice president, he himself is from South Carolina, and he himself is going to be pretty conflicted because he thought the state should nullify the law. He thought the state should just ignore it. But at the same time, he's in the White House, right, with Jackson. So he's loyal to South Carolina, but at the same time, he wants to honor the will of the federal government, even if he doesn't like it all that much. So he's saying basically, listen, he's basically telling his kind of South Carolina buddies behind closed doors, try to nullify this, don't really go for it. But again, he's conflicted because he's kind of, stuck between a rock and a hard place. And in 1830, there's going to be a very famous series of debates that happened between one Robert Hayne of South Carolina and Daniel Webster, was one of the most legendary members of Congress, even still known in Massachusetts. They're going to have a series of these grand debates, and Webster, being from the kind of the northern states, being from Massachusetts, that industrialized area, he's going to defend the Union, saying we need to keep the Union together, we need to keep the Union strong, and whatever we decide here in Washington, D.C., needs to be observed throughout the rest of the country, both North and South alike. Hayne, meanwhile, being kind of polar opposite, he's from South Carolina. He believes in states' rights. He thinks that, listen, if a state doesn't like what the federal government's saying or doing, they should be able to step in and nullify that. So they're going to have a series of these grand debates, which, again, this is a highly controversial issue, however you slice it, okay? But what is Jackson actually going to do? So after a lot of deliberation and a lot of internal debate on Jackson's part, he's going to kind of, a little bit surprisingly, rule in favor of the federal government. Now, being from the South and being from the West, a lot of people expected he would kind of side with South Carolina and be behind them nullifying that. But as president, he said, no, I'm kind of the leader of this union and I want to keep it together. And you, South Carolina, should observe this. And so tough luck, you're just going to have to deal with it. And also, new tariffs are then going to be instituted in 1832 by Congress, which South Carolina is going to vehemently protest, despite the kind of cuts per Jackson's request. So Jackson said, maybe not make it too harsh, but it doesn't really matter. And South Carolina is going to take an even larger step and organize a special state convention where they're actually going to formally adopt ordinances for nullification. So they're saying, we're actually going to take this pretty far and are going to try to nullify and cancel this law out the best way that we can. Because they're saying that these 1828 and 1832 tariffs, wholly unconstitutional. Jackson, since they're elevating their game, he's going to elevate his game a little bit and says, all right, you know what? If you're going to go this far, this is treasonous. This is worthy of kind of direct punishment on your part. And he's even going to send a naval warship to Charleston to enforce these tariffs to begin with. So, okay. And in 1833, after Jackson's reelected, Congress is going to pass the force bill, which is going to authorize the president military to use military force if a state or a people or whatever in the United States is not really following laws set by Congress. Okay, so anything basically this is saying the force bill gives the president basically almost unlimited authority to enforce laws passed by those at the by the federal government. The states have to obey those. Okay. So and this is going to start to lead to some criticisms, even from his own party, and certainly from the other one, that, hey, Jackson's taking this too far. He's kind of propping himself, up as a king who were kind of giving unlimited authority. So he's going to face criticism from both sides on this. Yet again, Senator Clay, he's still around. He's going to push Congress a bill to kind of start to lower the tariffs where they're not going to be so drastically raised through 1842. And so South Carolina is going to repeal its nullifications, and both sides are going to claim victory over this. So this came pretty close to something in terms of South Carolina trying to secede and trying to say, we're not going to, kind of acknowledge these tariffs in any way, shape, or form. And meanwhile, the Jackson and the federal government saying, we're willing to stop you if we need to. But both sides are going to start to back down and claim victory, which in of itself, both sides are happy about. But again, this has started to stir the pot when it comes to states stepping out against the federal government and what could possibly be the federal government's response to states doing this. So that really starts to raise temperatures between the federal and state governments. Now, so that's kind of a little bit debatable about what role Jackson played in that and if he made or did he not make the right decision. Most historians, myself included, would agree. This next thing is much more regrettable part of Jackson's legacy, and it involves his Native American policy. And basically when Jackson was inaugurated very early on in his presidency, he said, listen, we're going to move these Native Americans off to the Great Plains, and they're just going to have to deal with it. He had already had, a reputation as a Native American killer, a Native American hunter. And some of that goes back to his days fighting the Seminoles in Florida, kind of in the late 18-teens, early 1820s. So, again, he was really involved in that already. And in 1830, he is going to push Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act, which is basically going to gradually try to move a lot of Native Americans west. The Cherokee, most of these Native Americans just kind of go along with the flow because they don't want any violence. But the Cherokee in Georgia in particular are going to put up a fight because the Cherokee in Georgia were actually in an interesting position because they had already adopted a lot of white culture. They had already tried to assimilate in a pretty big, meaningful, and large way. So there's like, listen, we're basically white culturally. Why do we have to leave this area? Okay, they had their own written language. They had their very own kind of tribal constitution, and even went to the missionary schools that the white culture had set up. So in a lot of ways, they were even largely Christian. So the Cherokee are saying, hey, what gives? Why do we have to get out of here? Okay. Well, again, why? Basically, the Cherokee, reservation in kind of a little bit of North Carolina, but into Georgia, especially in Tennessee. Basically, there's a lot of gold deposits there, and a lot of prospectors, white prospectors, want to get in there and get that gold out from under them. And so that's really the biggest reason why there's going to be, people wanting to move in and get in there. Okay, a very important court case happens, Worcester versus Georgia, where some of these Native Americans are going to sue the state of Georgia in order to stay where they are, okay? And this even goes as high as the Supreme Court, where one John Marshall, Chief Justice, is going to rule in favor of the Cherokee because he's saying, listen, they're not doing anybody any harm. This is their land. Why should they have to leave? But again, it all comes down to the fact that there was gold under there that white prospectors wanted to get their hands on and not let the Native Americans profit from it anyway. But again, Worcester versus Georgia said, no, listen, they have the right to stay there. And that's a very important decision by the John Marshall Court. But very famously and very controversially, even to this very day, Jackson's just going to shake his head and shrug and refuse to enforce the court's decision, which we've never really had this happen before this, and really not anything close to it since, where the President of the United States is willfully ignoring what the Supreme Court said. In the past and in the future, whatever the Supreme Court says, whether the president likes it or not, they have to enforce it. Okay, but Jackson's just going to shrug and has the very famous quote here, where he says, "Marshall has made his opinion or decision. Now let him enforce it." Very large, very big fighting words here, where he's saying, "Listen, if you want to enforce it, why don't you go ahead and try to stop me?" Okay. And so that really is going to be a pretty big breach of presidential protocol. But again, that hasn't really happened since then to this extent, where the president just willfully ignored what the Supreme Court was instructing him to do. But also, there's not going to really be a means for the Supreme Court to enforce this. So it basically just happens where the Supreme Court's decision is essentially ignored. And Martin Van Buren, he's going to come along as Jackson's successor. And he's going to go as far as to actually send in the army and forcibly remove these poor Native American Cherokee from their homes and move them to modern-day Oklahoma. This is going to culminate in the very famous incident you may have heard of before called the Trail of Tears, where about all these Native Americans, Cherokee, are going to be moved out west. About 2,000 are going to starve in the camps before they even are waiting to go, and another 2,000 die due to starvation, disease, or just exposure to the journey. Okay, so this is horrific. This is awful. And a lot of 4,000 Native Americans are going to die just because of this really abhorrent policy. There's no really other word for it. Okay, and by 1838, so this is kind of after Jackson is not even president anymore. Martin Van Buren, his VP, his second VP was basically okay. Most Native Americans are living, east of the Mississippi, have been moved and are living on reservations. So Jackson's policy ended up working out for him and his supporters in the sense that they've successfully pushed back all these Native Americans farther west. Okay, and the truth of the matter is, most Americans, even people who weren't big fans of Jackson, supported these policies. Okay, now there were some who protested and didn't like it. Okay. National Republicans, which was kind of a spinoff of the Republicans, still not the Republicans of Lincoln and onward. Okay, Quakers, Methodists, people who had more religious reasons who were opposed to this. But as I said, most Americans are really just in favor of this. They don't really care. It doesn't affect them, so they shrug and say, "Well, it doesn't affect us. Why should we care?" But again, in the process, these poor Native Americans are being removed from their homes quite tragically. And as I said, over 4,000 are going to lose their lives along the way, which is, very sad and horrific. The other thing Jackson decides to do while he's in office is to kind of take on the national bank head on. He had been protesting the idea of the second national bank for some time, and he saw the bank, in some ways justifiably, in other ways maybe not so justifiably, as an instrument of the elite, the Eastern elite that he had always been protesting against while he was president. He's pointing at that and saying, this is only helping them. We need to dismantle the national bank. Okay. But the truth is, the national bank did a good job of stabilizing the national money supply and regulating state banks. But Jackson really didn't care. And upon his reelection in 1832, he's going to veto the bank's renewal, which had to be renewed every few years. And so that's going to effectively start to destroy the national bank. Okay. And so he's going to, that basically removes government deposits and transfers all of them into state banks. So he's saying, no, we don't need a national bank. We need a bunch of little state banks, which again, he's more for states' rights than he is in some ways for the federal government having power, right? So he's saying all that money we have in the national banks, let's just give it over to the state banks, okay? And naturally, the bank's going to just fall apart and promptly die, which at the short term, this was a major political victory for Jackson and the Democrats. So he succeeded at this. And again, this was really the brainchild going back to Alexander Hamilton and a lot of the Federalists of that time period who wanted, again, these national banks. But finally, really, it kind of promptly died off once they're taking more and more money away from that and putting it into the state banks. Okay. And so what's the aftermath of Jackson? Again, Martin Van Buren, he's going to become president soon after Jackson. And there had been a lot of opposition to Jackson over the years. While he was president, a new party had kind of formed and consecrated itself, known as the Whigs, okay? And the Whigs were in many ways protesting Jackson's policies. They're saying he's given too much power over to the states. We need a stronger federal government, one that supports industrial and commercial development and industrial and commercial aims. So they're saying we need to give more power back over to the federal government, not so much over to the state government. So the Whigs are going to come about as a result of this. And in 1836, Martin Van Buren, who was, again, Democrat, who was kind of Jackson's buddy, he's going to be elected president. And because the nation at the time, very prosperous, Jackson was popular, and the Whigs really weren't able to get behind a single candidate, which was a problem. They ran like three. That just watered down the vote, made it all the easier for Martin Van Buren, to become president. But what happens after that, after his election into 1837, is going to be the Panic of 1837. Basically an economic crisis, basically a mini depression that's going to happen in the 1830s, where lots of small businesses all across the country are going to start to fail as a result of that. Okay. So Van Buren, he's going to believe in, he's going to be a big believer that we don't need to step in too much to kind of resolve this crisis, that instead what we need to do is, let the states take a big hand in it. But actually, that's not going to do a lot. And so this Panic of 1837 is going to last for a bunch of years, or kind of basically the length of Martin Van Buren's presidency, and is going to start to sink him and some of his other Democratic allies as a result. Okay, so again, getting rid of that national bank was not a good thing, because if we had had a national bank during this time, it would have made the federal government much more equipped to handle that Panic of 1837. But again, Jackson had gotten rid of it, and they all clapped, and they all had a great time having got rid of it. But that Panic of 1837 proved actually maybe we do need some kind of larger stabilizing federal government force to take care of that. But again, Jackson and Van Buren wanted to get rid of it, and they did. And what happened as a result in some ways is that Panic of 1837, which leads to the last thing I'll say here. The election of 1840. Van Buren is going to face off against William Henry Harrison. Now, William Henry Harrison, he's going to be a Whig, and so the Whigs finally kind of got behind one single candidate and run him. And Harrison's going to be successful in this. And again, just real quick, William Henry Harrison was the guy who was, leader general during the War of 1812 and in a lot of Native American wars. And he's going to run the very famous slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because he had the very famous victory against Native Americans at Tippecanoe. And then John Tyler was his running mate. And so Tippecanoe and Tyler too is what that represented. So Harrison is going to win, but quite stupidly, he's going to, while he's giving his inaugural address, he decides not to wear a coat and says, I'm a big, tough man. I don't need a coat. Ends up giving like one of the longest inaugural addresses in history. It's like over an hour long, and it's cold in Washington, D.C. in March, and he's going to catch pneumonia and is going to die. Has the very shortest presidency in American history within a month. And so John Tyler is going to be the one who replaces him there. Okay. And John Tyler, again, his running mate. But the thing about Tyler was he was not nearly as kind of big of a Whig as Harrison was. And he's a former Democrat, which means that he's only really put on the ticket to try to attract Southern votes. And so the Whigs are going to be largely unsuccessful when they're frustrated because the Whig that they did have died of pneumonia because he was stupid and didn't wear a coat. So Tyler, he's going to really not going to do a whole lot to change. And they wanted to start a third national bank, the Whigs, that is. Tyler's not going to get behind that because he's still largely a Democrat. Okay. And they wanted to have more tariffs. He was not a fan of that. And so he's going to mostly side with the Democrats. So as it turns out, Jackson's legacy going into the 1840s is very much alive. Even though he's not president anymore, Van Buren kept what he had done. And then also this frustration of Harrison was going to change things, but then he died. And so Tyler's the one who's keeping things basically as they were. And so largely Jackson's legacy in the short term is going to be largely intact as a result of this. But again, there were a lot of those sectional tensions that we've been mentioning between North and South, federal versus state governments, that even Jackson himself couldn't quite get a handle on. Okay. And again, himself was a bit of a contradiction because he largely favored states' rights. But then on the other hand was, in other ways, was supporting the federal government. So in that way, it was kind of a frustrating era for a variety of reasons. But that's going to do it for today. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out and ask, and I'll be sure to get back in touch with you. Take care.